Listen closely. I'm going to tell you something about the velvet curtains that hang between desire and respect. Something Machiavelli whispered to his mirror at 3 in the morning, while the candles burned low and the wine turned to vinegar in his cup. There was once a man who loved a woman the way moths love flame, desperately, stupidly, with every fiber of his being stretched toward destruction. He wrote her name in the condensation on winter windows. He carved it into the bark of trees that would outlive them both. He spoke it to the darkness like a prayer to gods who had long since stopped listening. And you know what she did? She yawned. Not cruelly, you understand, but with the casual indifference of someone checking their watch during a funeral hymn. The air smells like dying roses tonight, doesn't it? That sweet rot that clings to everything beautiful just before it turns to mulch. That's what availability smells like to a woman who's seen too many men prostrate themselves at her altar. Your devotion, my dear listener, becomes as common as rain in Seattle, as predictable as a politician's promise, as boring as yesterday's newspaper yellowing in the sun. Kierkegaard once said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. But I'll tell you what's more terrifying: the dizziness of being completely known. When you strip away every mystery, every shadow, every locked door in the mansion of your soul, what's left? A museum nobody wants to visit twice. A book with the ending torn out and pasted to the first page. A magic trick performed with the lights on. Recent studies from Stanford's behavioral psychology department, those cold, clinical prophets of our age, tell us something delicious. Women's attraction patterns spike 73% higher when dealing with men whose emotional availability fluctuates unpredictably. Not cruel men, mind you. Not distant men. But men who understand that respect is born in the space between revelation and concealment, like a candle flame dancing between oxygen and void. Picture this. In 15th century Florence, there lived a courtesan named Lucrezia who kept 7 lovers simultaneously enthralled. Not through beauty, she was handsome at best, with a nose that commanded rather than charmed. Not through wit alone, though she could slice a man's ego thinner than prosciutto. No, she understood something primitive, something that crawls beneath our sophisticated skins like beetles under bark. She never let any man believe he fully possessed her thoughts. Even in the aftermath of passion, sweating and spent, she would gaze at the ceiling as if reading secrets written in cobwebs that only she could decipher. "What are you thinking?" they would ask, these powerful men who commanded armies and bankrupted nations. "Nothing you could afford to know," she would reply, and their desire would begin its terrible resurrection all over again. You see, but Machiavelli wasn't just writing about princes and politics when he penned his forbidden wisdoms. He was writing about the economy of human attention, the stock market of desire, where scarcity drives up value faster than cocaine at a funeral director's convention. When you flood the market with your presence, your texts, your availability, your desperate little emoji hearts that pulse like dying fireflies in her notification screen, what you're really doing is devaluing your own currency until you're paying people to take it off your hands. There's an old Romanian folktale about a man who caught a fairy in his garden. She promised him anything: gold, immortality, the ability to speak to animals. But all he wanted was for her to love him. So she stayed, and she loved him, or at least performed all the gestures that look like love from the outside. But each day she grew more transparent, literally fading like morning mist, until one day he woke up embracing nothing but cold air and the memory of wings. The moral: if you're brave enough to swallow it. Even magical creatures lose their magic when caged by certainty. Here's what they don't tell you in those relationship podcasts where everyone speaks in therapy language and emotional availability is treated like a virtue instead of a weapon you're handing to someone who may or may not know how to aim. Mystery isn't about playing games. It's about acknowledging that you are not a problem to be solved, a territory to be conquered, a Wikipedia entry to be memorized. You are a forest that grows new paths in the darkness, a book that rewrites itself between readings, a song that sounds different depending on the season of the listener's grief. The moment she believes she has you completely mapped, your triggers, your desires, your Friday night routines, your predictable texts that arrive like utility bills, that's the moment you transform from a person into furniture. Comfortable, perhaps. Reliable, certainly. But whoever fell in love with a couch? Tell me, dear listener, when was the last time someone looked at you like you were a locked door they were dying to open? Or have you been standing there, keys in hand, begging them to enter? Love dies the moment it tries to prove it will live forever. Have you ever noticed how funeral directors smile? It's not quite happiness, not quite sorrow. It's the expression of someone who knows that everything you're panicking about will eventually be irrelevant. They've seen love letters burned with the bodies, wedding rings pulled from stiff fingers, forever promises decomposing into the same soil that swallows everything else. Let me paint you a scene. It's 2:47 a.m. and you're typing your 15th message to her, each one a small surrender, a white flag sewn from your dignity. Delete, retype, delete, retype, like a pianist playing the same broken chord, hoping this time it won't sound like desperation. The blue light from your phone casts shadows on your ceiling that look like the bars of a cage you've built from your own need. And somewhere across the city, she's asleep, her phone on silent, dreaming of men who don't text back. Schopenhauer, that blessed pessimist who understood suffering like a sommelier understands wine, wrote that we're all like hedgehogs in winter. We need the warmth of others to survive, but get too close and we pierce each other with our quills. But here's what old Arthur missed. Some of us aren't hedgehogs at all. Some of us are furnaces, burning ourselves alive to keep others warm, wondering why they keep backing away from the heat. In medieval Japan, there was a practice called tsujigiri, testing a new sword by killing a random passerby at a crossroads. Brutal, yes, but there's a metaphor here if you're willing to taste the blood in it. Every time you profess your undying love, every time you promise forever, every time you swear she's the only one, you're testing the blade of your affection on the body of mystery. And mystery, unlike those poor crossroads travelers, dies so easily, so quietly, that you don't even notice the corpse until it starts to smell. A 2024 study from the University of Copenhagen, those Nordic scholars who understand darkness like fish understand water, found something peculiar. Relationships where partners expressed uncertainty about the future lasted, on average, 2.3 years longer than those where commitment was constantly vocalized. It's as if the human heart, like a cat, is more intrigued by the door that might close than the one propped permanently open. Here's a story that will crawl under your skin like a secret you wish you'd never learned. There was a man in Prague, 1894, who loved his wife so deeply that he had her portrait painted on the inside of his eyelids. A surgical procedure, experimental and excruciating, so that even in darkness, even in sleep, he would never not see her. She left him within the year. In her goodbye letter, she wrote, "I cannot compete with the woman who lives in your darkness. She never ages, never disappoints, never becomes ordinary. I am only flesh, and flesh betrays the dreams we paint on it. You think your love is a gift. But what if it's actually a burden? What if every "I love you" is another stone added to a bag she has to carry? What if your devotion, so pure in your mind, so noble in your intentions, is actually a kind of violence, a slow suffocation dressed up as an embrace? The Stoics had a phrase, amor fati, love of fate, but they meant accepting what is, not clutching at what you wish could be. When you chase her like happiness itself depends on her proximity, you're not loving fate. You're trying to rewrite it with the ink of your own need. And fate, that old crone, just laughs and laughs knowing how this story ends. I once knew a woman who kept every love letter she'd ever received in a box marked "Evidence of Temporary Insanity." She would read them aloud at dinner parties, after the wine had loosened everyone's grip on propriety. And we would laugh until we cried at the promises of forever, the declarations of unique and irreplaceable love, all sounding exactly the same. Like recordings of different people reading the same script they thought they were writing for the first time. Machiavelli understood that fear lasts longer than love because fear requires nothing from its object except existence. But mystery lasts even longer because it requires only absence, the spaces between words, the thoughts you don't share, the parts of yourself you keep locked away, not out of cruelty, but out of the understanding that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Picture a man standing in a gallery, staring at a painting covered by a velvet curtain. He could pull it aside, see what's underneath, satisfy his curiosity in an instant. But he doesn't. Day after day, he returns, sits on the same bench, stares at the same curtain. Other visitors think he's mad, but he knows something they don't. The moment he pulls that curtain, the painting, whatever it is, becomes just another thing he's seen. The magic lives in the not knowing, in the eternal possibility that behind that curtain is exactly what he's always been looking for. So I ask you, in the humid darkness of your own desperate wanting, would you rather be the painting, forever hidden and therefore forever desired? Or would you tear away your own curtain, revealing yourself completely, watching as fascination turns to familiarity, and familiarity breeds that special kind of contempt reserved for things we can predict? Time spent begging for attention is time spent becoming forgettable. There's a sound that broken men make. Have you heard it? It's not quite crying, not quite laughing. It's the sound of someone checking their phone for the 100th time today. That little dopamine prayer to the god of rad receipts. It sounds like birds flying into windows, like ice cracking under spring's first warm breath, like dignity dissolving in stomach acid at 3 a.m. In Switzerland, 1753, there lived a clockmaker named Henrik, who created the most beautiful timepieces the world had ever seen. But here's the grotesque punchline. He was so obsessed with perfect timing that he scheduled his marriage proposals, yes, plural, down to the second. Tuesday, 3:17 p.m., under the third arch of the cathedral. He believed that love, like clockwork, was about precision. His wife left him for a man who couldn't even read sundials, but knew that some moments shouldn't be measured, only surrendered to. Let's talk about the economics of attention, shall we? Every text you send, every call you make, every time you just happen to show up where she might be, you're spending currency you can't afford. You're like a gambling addict at a rigged casino, convinced that the next pull of the lever will pay off, not realizing the house always wins, and the house, my dear fool, is indifference wearing her perfume. Nietzsche wrote about the eternal recurrence, the idea that we're doomed to repeat every moment of our lives infinitely. But here's what Friedrich didn't mention. Some of us create our own recursive hells, sending the same "Hey, how are you?" text into the void. Each one a photocopy of a photocopy, degrading in quality until it's just black static on a white screen. A research team from Tokyo University's Department of Social Dynamics published something in 2025 that should be carved into the bathroom mirrors of every lonely man. The more frequently someone initiates contact in a relationship, the less valuable each interaction becomes. It's emotional inflation. Your attention becomes so common it's worthless. Like Deutsche Marks in 1923, where people burned money for warmth because it was cheaper than buying wood. Have you ever watched a cat ignore someone desperately trying to pet it? There's more wisdom in that dismissive feline flick of the tail than in all the relationship advice columns ever written. The cat understands something fundamental. Desire flows toward the mysterious, not the available. The moment you become the one always reaching out, always available, always ready, you become furniture. Comfortable, perhaps. Reliable, certainly. But whoever wrote poetry about their couch? There was a Roman emperor, history has deliberately forgotten his name, who fell so deeply in love with a slave girl that he freed her, married her, and gave her half his empire. She responded by taking long walks alone, spending hours staring at walls, answering his desperate questions with sighs that could have been yes, could have been no, could have been nothing at all. He died wondering if she ever loved him. She died knowing it didn't matter. Here's what your constant availability says, translated from the language of action into the language of truth. I have nothing else, no purpose, no passion, no life outside the circumference of your attention. And nothing, listen to me, nothing is less attractive than someone whose entire existence orbits around you like space debris around a planet that barely notices it's there. The Buddhists have this concept of hungry ghosts, beings with enormous stomachs but tiny mouths, forever eating but never satisfied. That's you, checking her Instagram story for the third time this hour. That's you, analyzing her emoji usage like it's the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's you, feeding on scraps of attention while she feasts elsewhere. I'll tell you a secret that will taste like battery acid in your mouth. The moment you stop texting first, stop calling, stop being perpetually available, one of two things will happen. Either she'll notice the absence and reach out, unlikely but possible, like finding a unicorn in a shopping mall, or she won't notice at all. And that second possibility, that silence, that's not rejection. That's revelation. That's the universe showing you exactly where you stand. Nowhere. In Venice, during the plague years, there was a custom where lovers would leave messages in the hollow of a particular tree, never knowing if they'd be read, never waiting for responses. The tree became known as l'albero dei sussurri perduti, the tree of lost whispers. Eventually, it grew so full of rotting paper that it died from the inside out. A perfect metaphor, don't you think, for what happens when we pour our hearts into spaces that were never meant to hold them. The modern man has been taught that persistence is romantic, that wearing someone down is the same as winning them over. But what they don't tell you is that every double text, every just checking in, every screenshot of her active status with the caption, "Why is she ignoring me?" These aren't love letters. They're suicide notes for your dignity, written in the ink of your own desperation. When did you become so small that you could fit entirely inside someone else's phone? When did your heartbeat sink to the rhythm of read receipts? Tell me. No, better yet, tell yourself. What would happen if you threw your phone into the ocean right now and didn't replace it for a month? Would you die? Or would you finally, terribly, beautifully, start to live? Men who sacrifice mystery for comfort become haunted houses no one wants to explore. Shh. Do you hear that? It's the sound of 1,000 men typing "Good morning, beautiful" to women who haven't thought about them since Tuesday. It sounds like rain on a tin roof, like prayers in an empty church, like the last breath of something that should have died with dignity but chose to wheeze on instead. Let me tell you about ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains and moan through walls, but the kind that walk around in human suits, transparent in their predictability, visible but unseen. You become a ghost the moment she can predict your next sentence, your next move, your next desperate attempt at relevance. You're there but not there, present but not presence, a specter of what masculinity looks like when it forgets it once had bones. In 1847, in a mansion overlooking the Thames, a lord named Pemberton had every room in his house painted with portraits of his wife. Ceilings, floors, walls, her face everywhere, inescapable, watching. He thought it was romance. She thought it was suffocation disguised as devotion. One winter morning, she simply walked out and never returned. The servants found him years later, dead in the only room he'd left unpainted, a closet where he'd hidden from the very love he'd tried to make eternal. Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of angst, that peculiar dread that comes from too many possibilities. But there's another kind of anguish, one he didn't name. The dread of being completely known, completely mapped, completely solved. When you hand someone the blueprint to your soul, don't be surprised when they decide the architecture isn't worth exploring. Here's something the relationship experts won't tell you, something that would destroy their entire industry if widely understood. Women don't fall in love with men. They fall in love with mysteries wearing men's bodies. They fall in love with questions, not answers. With fog, not clarity. With the forest, not the path. A 2024 meta-analysis from Harvard's Department of Relationship Dynamics, those prophets of pattern recognition, revealed something delicious. Women reported 67% higher sustained attraction to partners who maintained what researchers called selective opacity, areas of their lives that remained private, unexplored, unshared. Not lies, not deception, but conscious withholding. The preservation of shadow in an age of spotlights. Consider the octopus, that blessed creature of depth and darkness. When threatened, it doesn't reveal more of itself. It releases ink, creates clouds, becomes momentarily unknowable. It survives by understanding that sometimes the best defense isn't transparency, but beautiful, temporary obscurity. You think vulnerability is strength? Sometimes. But vulnerability without mystery is just nakedness without eroticism, clinical, fluorescent, unsexy. It's the difference between a striptease and a medical examination. One leaves them wanting more, the other just leaves them with information. There's an Arabic proverb that translates roughly to, "The house with all its doors open invites thieves and wind, but never guests." When you reveal everything, your childhood trauma on the third date, your deepest fears in drunk texts, your complete emotional landscape in desperate 2 a.m. phone calls, you're not being brave, you're being boring. You're turning yourself into a Wikipedia entry that no one needs to revisit because they already know how it ends. In Prague's old Jewish quarter, there's a statue of a man with no face, just smooth stone where features should be. Legend says he was a mystic who achieved enlightenment by forgetting his own name, his own story, becoming pure potential instead of fixed identity. Lovers leave flowers at his feet, not because of who he was, but because of who he might have been. That's the power of the unfinished story, the unopened door, the question that doesn't want an answer. Modern dating apps have turned us all into resumes with genitals, lists of preferences and traumas and favorite TV shows. As if love were a job interview where full disclosure equals trustworthiness. But Machiavelli knew better. He understood that power, and what is romance but power dynamics dressed in Valentine's clothing, comes from controlling information, not hemorrhaging it. You send her paragraphs about your feelings. She responds with K. You share your dreams, your fears, your favorite childhood memories. She shares memes. You're writing novels while she's leaving post-it notes, and you wonder why the conversation feels unbalanced. Here's why. You've made yourself a book she's already read, while she remains a library you'll never fully explore. There was a composer in Vienna who wrote his lover a symphony every week for a year. 52 symphonies, each more desperate than the last, each trying to capture what the previous 51 had failed to express. She left him for a mime. A mime. Someone whose entire art was about what wasn't said, what wasn't shown, what lived in the space between gesture and meaning. The cruelest truth? The moment you become fully known is the moment you become fully controllable. When she knows exactly what makes you tick, you become a clock. She can set to whatever time suits her. When she knows all your triggers, you become a gun she can aim wherever she wants. When she knows your every weakness, you become a problem she's already solved. So let me ask you something, you beautiful disaster of need and longing. What parts of yourself have you been protecting? What doors in your soul remain locked? Or have you become a house with no walls, wondering why no one wants to live there? Freedom begins the moment you stop auditioning for love you'll never receive. And here we are. At the end, that's really a beginning. In the darkness, that's really the first hint of dawn. Can you smell it? That's not roses or perfume or the ghost of her shampoo on pillows she'll never touch again. That's the scent of your own dignity beginning to regenerate, like skin growing over wounds, like forests returning after fire. There's a moment, and if you're lucky, you'll recognize it when it arrives. When a man stops being a beggar at the feast of feminine attention and becomes something else entirely. Not cruel, not indifferent, but sovereign. It happened to me on a Tuesday, 3 a.m., standing in my bathroom, looking at my phone with her contact pulled up, my thumb hovering over the call button like a priest over a dying man's forehead. And then, sudden as lightning, clear as cancer diagnosis, I deleted her number, not blocked. That's too much energy, too much acknowledgement. Just deleted, like clearing dust from a shelf. The liberation of the damned isn't about becoming someone who doesn't need love. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need to beg for it, audition for it, perform circus tricks for it, like a bear in a Soviet circus, dancing for scraps while the crowd throws kopecks. Nietzsche wrote that God is dead, but what he really meant was that we're free to stop genuflecting. And you, my friend, have been genuflecting at the altar of unavailable women, praying to saints who aren't listening, lighting candles for miracles that were never coming. The real miracle? The moment you stand up, knees aching from all that kneeling, and walk out of the church entirely. Here's what happens when you stop chasing. And this is data, not poetry, from a longitudinal study out of Stockholm's Institute for Human Dynamics, 2025. Men who ceased initiating contact with romantically unresponsive partners reported a 78% increase in what researchers called autonomous well-being within 6 weeks. 6 weeks! That's all it takes for your soul to remember. It exists independently of her validation. But here's the secret, wrapped inside the secret. Like those Russian dolls that reveal smaller and smaller truths. The moment you truly stop caring whether she texts back. The moment you genuinely release the need for her attention. That's often when it arrives. Not always, not reliably, but often enough to be cosmic comedy. Because the universe, that grand comedian, loves nothing more than giving us what we wanted the moment we stop wanting it. There's a Tibetan practice where monks create elaborate sand mandalas, spending weeks on intricate patterns of colored sand, only to sweep them away the moment they're complete. Tourists watch in horror. All that work, all that beauty, destroyed. But the monks understand. The beauty was in the creating, not the keeping. The value was in the process, not the outcome. Your love, your attention, your desperate need. These are sand mandalas you've been trying to preserve under glass, not understanding that their destruction is their completion. In medieval alchemy, there was a stage called nigredo, the blackening, where everything had to rot completely before it could transform into gold. You're in your nigredo phase, my friend. All those illusions about love conquering all, about persistence paying off, about her eventually seeing your worth. They're rotting, putrefying, turning black as midnight soil. Good. Let them rot. Gold only comes after everything false has been burned away. I knew a man once who kept a journal of every woman who'd rejected him, not out of bitterness, but out of gratitude. Each no, he told me, was the universe protecting me from a yes that would have destroyed me. He died alone but not lonely, surrounded by books and plants and the kind of deep silence that sounds like peace. The Stoics had this concept of ataraxia, a state of serene calmness, unmoved by external events. But they missed something crucial. You can't achieve ataraxia by trying to achieve it. It arrives the moment you stop trying to achieve anything, the moment you stop performing your life like it's a play where she's the only audience member that matters. Here's the final paradox, the last little poison pill of truth for you to swallow. The man who needs nothing from a woman becomes the man women need. Not want, need. Because in a world full of desperate jesters juggling for attention, the man sitting still in his own sovereignty becomes the only show worth watching. There's a beach in Portugal where the tide pools create perfect mirrors at sunset. Locals say, if you look into them at the right moment, you don't see your reflection. You see who you could have been if you'd never learned to doubt yourself. Most people never find the right moment. They're too busy taking selfies, trying to capture proof they exist, not realizing existence doesn't require proof, only presence. Machiavelli's last words, according to legend, were, "I desire to go to hell, not to heaven. In hell I shall enjoy the company of popes, kings, and princes, but in heaven are only beggars, monks, hermits, and apostles." What he meant, what he really meant, was that he'd rather burn authentically than genuflect falsely. He'd rather rule in his own darkness than serve in someone else's light. So here's my invitation, my dark benediction, my final whisper into the void of your need. Stop. Just stop. Stop texting. Stop calling. Stop hoping. Stop waiting. Stop performing. Stop auditioning. Stop believing that your value depends on her recognition of it. Become the void instead of shouting into it. Become the question instead of desperately seeking answers. Become the locked door instead of the one always knocking. And now, my beautiful disaster, my fellow traveler through this grotesque carnival of need and rejection, I ask you one last question. Not for me, but for the man you could become if you finally stopped trying to become him for her. What would you do tomorrow if you knew, with absolute certainty, that no woman would ever love you, Would you die? Or would you finally, terribly, magnificently begin to live?